relatively famous British historian. He'll remain nameless. I saw that he written a book about the Second World War. I opened it up, as I do sometimes, look up, Romania in the index, and turned to the page, and the very first thing was like, well, Nazi occupied Romania. I just kind of closed the book, put it back, and decided I wasn't going to read his book, because it's such a basic fact to get wrong.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Mythbusting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history and historical figure, or a piece of equipment, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some things that people get wrong. We'll also cover a few things you may not know. Today we're discussing an often overlooked part of the Second World War, and in particular one country's involvement, Romania. Joining me for the first time on the channel is the historian and expert in Romanian World War II history, Grant Harward. Welcome to Times Radio History, Grant. Great to have you with us. Now, we should say you've written two brilliant books about this period in history. One of them is called Romania 1944, The Turning of Arms Against Nazi Germany, and that's just been released. Tell us a bit about the book and also why this particular aspect of the Second World War fascinates you so much.
Well, in some ways it was chosen for me because Osprey Publishing contacted me after seeing news about my other book, and said they wanted to do a volume about Romania changing sides, to put it briefly, in World War II, which is, I think, something that will fascinate a lot of people. And it's kind of a very dramatic moment and this kind of unusual thing that we see in World War II of, also looking at Italy, but Romania does it. Finland switches sides. I think this always is something that attracts a lot of attention. And Romania's case is one that I think gets overlooked. And so they wanted to rectify that. And I was eager to help out Osprey Publishing to do that.
And why do you think it is overlooked so much? Because as we'll get into when we start talking about your myths, I mean, there's some genuinely fascinating stories to tell.
I think there's a few things there. There's a language. Romanian itself is a Latin-based language. It's one that kind of doesn't get a lot of attention because it's not a Slavic one. So it doesn't kind of pull into that realm. So Slavics, people who know Russian can't pick up Bulgarian or Czech as easily. I think also, something like Finland gets all this press because of the Winter War. And so then what happens to it later, it makes it more interesting. And Romania gets lost. And the Eastern Front is so big in the Second World War. I mean, really, it's like 3 or 4 fronts, put together.
And do you find, Grant, that you come up quite often against a lot of myths around Romania in World War II?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of ignorance. But then what does peter through into, and there is a few myths, and my book tries to tackle a couple of the main ones. But yeah, I think a lot of what we have is kind of generalities, myths, and stereotypes rather than a real hard look, an in-depth look at Romania in the war, and specifically the Romanian army, which I focus on.
And just to go over the real-life history very briefly for those who aren't 100% familiar with it before we get into the myths, they switched sides in 1944, and it was all because of a coup.
Yeah, so I guess, they go into the war beginning with neutrality, although they're already in the German orbit. They've signed economic agreements. They already have a royal dictatorship. That gets toppled in 1940, and Romania has a right-wing government that takes over under a general. There's still a king, but it's a successor king. And they join the Axis, and then they join the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. And then up until late summer 1944, they fight alongside the Germans. Then when the Soviets basically are breaking down the door, overrunning Romania, the young king is able to carry out a coup to then take Romania out of the Axis, which then the Soviets then require Romania to switch sides and provide troops for the last 9 months of the year, 9 months of the war. And so for the last bit of the war, they actually fight against Nazi Germany.
Well, let's get into your 5 myths about Romania in World War II. And your first one looks at the misconception over Romania's very role in the conflict. Was it only important because of its oil, Grant?
No. I think that's the big thing. Yeah, I think so many histories, if Romania gets mentioned, they mention the oil, talk about how important it is. I mean, about a third of the oil for Nazi Germany comes from Romania. It's the most important source of crude oil. I mean, Germany is producing other oil, especially synthetic oil, throughout the war that helps keep it going. But Romania is this major source of natural crude oil, petroleum, oil, and lubricants necessary for your tanks, necessary for your aircraft and everything. But that's not all Romania is. But that's usually what gets mentioned. There's an important geographic factor. It offers an important base of operations for the Germans in Southeast Europe. It also is an entry point into Southeast Europe later on in 1944. But in 1941, it's an important base for an attack. You have, just as importantly as those factors is the Romanian military, which is fairly large for this relatively small country. They supply, at the outset of Operation Barbarossa, from the very first day, they have 320,000 soldiers on the line, and they join in the initial bombardment. They don't wait. They also have an air force, the largest in the region, and they also have it's a small navy, but for the Black Sea, where the Germans have no naval assets, it's the most important part. They have 4 destroyers, a fair number of like minesweepers and corvettes and stuff like that. Plus, you can add on some Bulgarian stuff. But Romania is really important there, and for the Black Sea operations as well. And this gets really overlooked. And these military contributions make Romania uniquely important, especially since Hitler decides to make the Eastern Front one of, if not the decisive theaters of war for Nazi Germany.
I mean, that's a really good point about Romania's military contribution. It is worth remembering they were the 3rd largest Axis army in the European theatre. How effective were they?
It's a mixed bag in some ways, because they don't get as much training, they don't have as much equipment. Although in 1941 they're kind of as well equipped and trained as maybe they could be. By 1942 they get a lot of experience through combat, and they are able to retrain some of their forces that had been demobilized. So actually in 1942 you're kind of seeing the peak. They also re-equip, and they get captured weapons and new weapons from Nazi Germany. And the Soviets at this point haven't been able to themselves rearm and get lots and lots of Lend-Lease. So they actually are fairly effective, much more effective than is generally given credit. That's one of those myths, is just that that we're going to cover here, of about their motivation to fight, overall, if we're looking at effectiveness, they're not as effective as the Germans, of course, but they're much more effective than is generally recognized.
And look, if we're talking about Romania's role in the Second World War, we do need to address the Holocaust. What is the truth of Romania's role in that?
Romania, participated in the Holocaust, had its own independent policies. It focuses initially on basic what they call cleansing the terrain of Jews in territory that had been occupied by the Soviets in 1940. Which I think we'll talk about in a little bit, but there's this kind of divide where on the front, as they advance, they cleanse the terrain of Jews in Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, and later all of Bukovina, even parts that weren't occupied by the Soviets. Jews are either murdered or then they're deported. Then they also get involved in the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, in Romanian occupied territories, but also in territories administered by the Germans. As the Germans start carrying out the final solution, the Romanians are on the scene to help out. So just like with the German army supporting the SS Einsatzgruppen in mass murder, the Romanian army is doing the same as well.
Well, let's come on to your second myth now about Romania in the Second World War. And this one might be the most pervasive. This is the idea that Romania was occupied by Nazi Germany. Tell us a bit about why that is a myth.
Yeah, this one is an important one. It sneaks in there. I think it's in part because Western audiences, we know Nazi Germany and we know Nazi-occupied Europe. And it's hard for us to see a middle ground, that there were other countries that were part of Nazi-dominated Europe, but they weren't occupied by Nazi Germany. And this is a pet peeve of mine, because it's very easy to tell that these countries weren't occupied. So Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland, but there's a relatively famous British historian, he'll remain nameless. I saw that he written a book about the Second World War. I opened it up, as I do sometimes, and look up, Romania in the index, and turn to the page, and the very first thing was like, well, Nazi occupied Romania. I just kind of closed the book, put it back, and decided I wasn't going to read his book, because it's such a basic fact to get wrong. But I think it's, Romania does come under pressure from Nazi Germany. Like I said, in 1940, the Soviets are able to occupy eastern Romania, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, because at that point, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are coordinating, and they have done this secret pact as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There's this secret protocol. So the Soviets are able to grab that land from Romania after an ultimatum. And then afterwards, Romania also has, there's Hungary wants territory, Bulgaria wants territory. While Romania is able to kind of make a land deal with Bulgaria, it has more difficulty with Hungary, and kind of the price of admission for Romania to join the Axis is to cede some territory to Hungary, and so that they can make nice, and then Romania can then gain the protection of Nazi Germany from the Soviets. So there is a bit of coercion there that people can use and have used to spin, saying, "Oh, Romania, really didn't want to be part of this. That Romania was kind of coerced into joining the Axis. Romania has to lose northern Transylvania to Hungary, and they're just angry about that the whole time. And this is a sore point for Romanians. But if you read the records, they were willing to pay that price in order to get German tanks and troops into the country, to then, protect them from further Soviet expansion. And then they enthusiastically join in the invasion. So during that entire period from 1940, September 1940, all the way to August of 1944, it's not occupied by Nazi Germany. It's not an occupation regime. The Romanians have control. The Germans are there, invited as allies. And so it's a very different dynamic than France, than, the occupied lowland countries, or even like, Northern Italy after 43. I think we need to understand that this is a country that has its sovereignty still. It's sure their Germans can exert pressure, but it's not an occupied country. And so things like joining the war, pursuing a policy of ethnic cleansing against Jews, in these liberated territories, these are decisions made by an independent country. These are independent policies.
I mean, it is staggering what you say there, Grant, about even well-known historians writing that Romania was Nazi-occupied during the Second World War. I suppose that raises the question, why is this particular myth so pervasive if it is so easily disprovable? Is it simply sloppiness? Is it people saying Nazi-occupied when they should say Nazi-allied? Where does it come from?
I think there's a bit of sloppiness to it, and I think there's probably an attitude of not wanting to challenge readers sometimes, because immediately when you start getting into this, it causes complications, because it's not so black and white, right? It's not just, there's the Nazis who are bad, and then there's Nazi-occupied Europe. There's just kind of two zones, right? Well, actually, there's this third zone that we don't, a lot of us don't talk about, especially in the Anglophone world, where we focus on, the Western Front, on Western Europe. And so I think that added complications, and I think there's a certain dismissal of Romania. People maybe don't do their due diligence, they will know that if Finland wasn't occupied by Nazi Germany, yet it was still part of the, joined the invasion, was still part of Nazi dominated Europe. They'll give that fair attention. But because it's Romania or Bulgaria, we don't really need to put that much effort into it. So I think there's just some cultural biases as well, kind of for certain authors, and maybe looking at certain audiences.
Yeah, and just briefly, give us a flavour of what the regime was like in Romania when it was allied with the Nazis, because it was under a fascist dictator essentially, General Antonescu.
So it's an interesting. He's fascistic, I would say, more than fascist. He's an interesting character. He's kind of not. He's lauded as kind of a World War I hero. He's a big personality in the 1930s. He cultivates a lot of right-wing connections to Christian nationalists, a different party. He also works with the fascist movement, the legionary movement in the 1930s. So he's kind of always angling for a position, and he has this reputation for like incorruptibility, which is one of the reasons why he finally gets called in, because he has these right-wing connections, because he has this reputation for incorruptibility. The King Carol II, is seen as infinitely corruptible and corrupted. And so when the Soviets demand territory and he gives it up, it really weakens his regime. It allows Antonescu to then kind of be invited in as prime minister and then grab dictatorial powers, push the king out, and take the king's dictatorial powers because the king had already set up a dictatorship, and then bring himself to power, and he brings the fascists to power for a little bit, but then he suppresses them. And so it's more of a military dictatorship with some fascistic overtones. He doesn't have like a party, he doesn't try to create a party, like a Nazi party or something like that. He kind of rules through the military, even replaces a lot of the county leadership with military officers. And like I said, he uses the army to put down the fascists when they get to a point where there's actually a revolt in January 1941 by some of the fascists because they want more power, and he's able to suppress that. So it's a repressive regime, authoritarian regime, but not a particularly super violent regime. There's some few hundreds put in prison. There's some that are executed, but he doesn't need to do that because most of the country is actually on his side. They agree with his general war aims. They agree with the persecution of the Jews, deportation of Roma later. They see the Soviet Union as a huge threat, and he still has this reputation of being, a nationalist and incorrupted, uncorruptible, and so he's somebody that people are willing to follow. He's not very beloved. He's kind of a harsh personality, but he's seen as somebody who's going to guide Romania through, and the military is kind of seen as the last kind of honorable institution that can do this.
Okay, let's move on to myth number 3 now, and this one is around one of the big themes of your books, and this is that Romania was a reluctant member of the Axis somehow, and it didn't have the motivation to fight on the Eastern Front. Is that true?
No, I mean, I argue, this is the main thrust of my book, is to argue that Romanian soldiers weren't unmotivated, that Romania wasn't a reluctant member of the Axis. I basically kind of work out that if you look at what's going on in Romania in the society, and the ideologies that permeated it, it's got a lot of nationalism. It uses religion to kind of build that up, and but also anti-Semitism gets in the mix. There's anti-Semitism throughout Romania. They see the Jews as the internal enemy, but not importantly as also an external enemy because it gets linked to anti-communism. There's, of course, anti-communism is a legitimate, ideology, but it's taken to extremes, especially when it gets supercharged with anti-Semitism, and there's just kind of, and if you throw on the religion and nationalism as well, and so there's this idea of this another myth of Judeo-Bolshevism or Jewish communism, and this means that there's this kind of big scary thing that you can fight, but also means that there's like an internal enemy. And so it's the Jews and the Soviets are seen as such a huge threat, that, and like, as I just mentioned, there's a fascist movement, right? So there's and Romania has one of the largest interwar fascist movements. So it's a conservative country. very even it's like kind of moderate parties are more to the right. There's no it's not very industrialized. So you don't have workers. You don't have a large left wing kind of socialist movement or communist movement in the country. And so, when the war breaks out, especially once the Soviets demand this territory in 1940, and then during that, when that territory is turned over, the Romanian army withdraws, and it's seen as something embarrassing. And Antonescu takes over after this, and he promises to get revenge and to restore Romania. And so when 1941 comes around, Romanians are very willing to support the war effort, and the soldiers are very motivated. And this is one of the reasons why you also have this ethnic cleansing, because the regime realizes that it can use this as an opportunity, all this anti-Jewish hate and the myth of Jewish Bolshevism. And it's not just cynical, like Antonescu and his leaders believe this as well. It's not just cynically, we know the Jews aren't responsible, but we're gonna ethnically cleanse them. They believe this as well. And so Romanian soldiers fight very well. They also commit atrocities. They fight, they're important in battles in Crimea, in 1942, they play a big role in the battles at Stalingrad, they continue to fight through 1943 and then in 1944. I mean, they are there. I mean, other countries drop out, like Hungary kind of minimizes its contribution after Stalingrad, and Italy, pulls out completely in part because it also then, collapses and switches sides. But, Romania is constantly fighting, constantly providing troops, and has the largest by far contribution to the Eastern Front, up to almost 500,000 troops in 1942, but even like 100,000 troops in 1943 when a lot of the other countries aren't even really fighting on the front.
So this idea that somehow the Romanian troops weren't as committed, that's just nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, and so we can look at also German records. I mean, the German liaison, this is an interesting viewpoint because the Germans interact with all these allies. And if you look at their records, they can say, like, of our allies, the Romanians are the most motivated. They fight the best. And they also are the most enthusiastic about this whole final solution against the Jews. So, I mean, I think we underestimate the motivation of most of these troops, whether Finnish or Italian or Hungarian, who are fighting in these kind of national armies on the Eastern Front. But the Romanians especially are, from what I've researched, the most motivated in kind of the totality of Hitler's war of annihilation. Right? They are motivated to fight the Red Army, and they're also motivated to fight these internal enemies, especially Jews.
I just wonder, Grant, I mean, I know that you have visited Romania a lot when researching your books. What is the general feel now around their involvement in the war? Is it something the country has come to terms with?
I think it's still grappling with that, in part because they have they eventually switch sides. So you have that last 9 months where they're on the Allies' side. And during communism, that gets emphasized. They only talk about that period of time, really. And, they present Romania as occupied as by the Nazis. And so they present that there's like a national uprising. And so that's glorified. And then in the 1990s, when communism falls, there's a rather simplistic co-glorification of the Eastern Front, because we have these idea of totalitarianism, right? That like basically Nazism and communism are equally bad. And so in the 1990s, they basically say, "Oh, look, we get to celebrate that we fought Nazism and communism." And the Eastern Front is brought up and kind of co-celebrated. Antonescu is rehabilitated to a certain degree. There's like statues put up to him. There are like roads named after him in the 1990s. All at the same time that you have more research coming out talking about the Holocaust. Kind of comes to a head in 2003 when you have some statements by the Romanian president and other officials saying the Holocaust didn't happen in Romania, which leads to a backlash in wider Europe. And Romania is kind of required to create a commission on what actually happened in the Holocaust and recognize what happened. And so since 2004, under Elie Wiesel, they've recognized, okay, we participated in the Holocaust as well. And so officially Romania has recognized that. They've only this year started to more integrate Holocaust and Jewish history education into the high school curriculum and introduce a new textbook. I mean, so we're looking at 30 years or 20 years to get that to that point. So it's still being grappled with today of what the Eastern Front meant, and kind of backing, there are some people that want to basically reintroduce wartime propaganda of celebrating the Eastern Front as a holy war and accepting that at face value and ignoring, the realities that also included ethnic cleansing of Jews, brutal anti-partisan warfare, and other atrocities committed in the Soviet Union. And so it's still something being grappled with today.
Okay, let's come on to your penultimate myth now, Grant. And we've talked a lot about Stalingrad on Times Radio History before, but there is this myth that the Romanians were somehow to blame for Germany's loss here. What is the truth to that?
Yeah, I mean, the big part is this idea that the Romanians didn't fight. That, once again, this goes back to this idea that they weren't motivated, that they're demoralized, that they kind of weren't worth much. And so it kind of goes beyond just like, oh, they weren't well equipped. There's a lot of Germans literally say they didn't fight. And this is just simply not true. The Romanians, the motivation is sound. The morale is actually pretty good at this time, and they are ready to fight. And if you go in and read, their reports, the Romanians fight as hard as they can during the Battle of Stalingrad. They are put in on the flanks. Outside Stalingrad, in the south on the Kalmuk steppe, there's a Romanian corps that's later reinforced with another one, becomes Romanian Fourth Army, and then you have another four corps that are put out in the Don Bend to the west. So they're having to hold the flanks, and so they're kind of fighting like kind of a World War I trench warfare, right, to allow the Germans to move more troops into the nasty urban conflict. But they're fighting in the weeks beforehand, and then they're just exposed. And there's not even, I don't think, any German units that could have withstood the amount of armor that the Soviets were, concentrated amount of artillery that gets concentrated. But in fact, the Soviets actually don't have their own way. It actually takes them longer to break through. And there's a Romanian group of several divisions, the Lascar group, that continues to hold out for days and causing problems during the Soviet breakthrough on the Don Bend. And if you read I've read diaries and memoirs of these soldiers. I mean, they're trying to do everything they can. They're firing weapons, artillery over open sites because they have a lack of anti-tank guns. They're using German anti-tank or hunting tactics, using anti-tank mines. They're even have gotten bundles of dried up brush and soaked them in fuel to try to throw onto Soviet tanks, especially for the smaller tanks. This used to work, that you get something burning on them. They could get sucked into their air intakes and, interrupt, the vehicle's engine or choke the crew and kind of disable, get a mobility kill. They're doing this, in this freezing cold weather. And the other thing is that we usually leave out is that after getting pummeled in November, they continue to fight through December. I mean, the Romanian troops are what allow the Germans to even try to do a relief operation Winter Storm in December. And they, Romanian cavalry and infantry, these remnants of these armies, are holding the line and also participating in that attack. They continue to fight. It takes Operation Uranus and Operation Little Storm Little Saturn to finally knock out the Romanian armies from that Stalingrad campaign, and it's really overlooked.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point there. I mean, is it almost the case that they were just used as cannon fodder, and as a result, also the Nazis just used them as a scapegoat?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, the Nazis the Germans need bodies on the ground at this point of the war. I mean, they go into this knowing, they go into Case Blue knowing that they're short of personnel. They know they have to rely more on these allies, and they just have to hope that they can hold the line. And even though when they know, I mean, there's this, kind of German arrogance, towards these units, but they need them as well. And then, once you have this disaster, that's really of German strategic decisions and operational decisions, and Hitler ignoring advice to withdraw, because I mean, he had his logistics guys telling him that we can't, even if we take Stalingrad, we can't logistically support German Sixth Army and the Romanians, through the winter. We need to pull back, and he ignores all of that. Once you have this failure, it's really easy for the Germans to blame their allies, and not just the Romanians, but also the Italians and Hungarians who are farther up along the Don River. But the Romanians get the lion's share of the blame, and this gets really nasty. I mean, there's points where weeks later, where German soldiers are throwing Romanian soldiers out of shelters, saying only soldiers who fight get shelter, right? That gunpoint sometimes. So things can become pretty nasty. There's recriminations at the top levels. This is kind of papered over eventually. So a few, Hitler actually fires a few German generals and even puts one in jail in order to appease Antonescu. I think this is also, again, another sign of how important the Romanians are, that Hitler's willing to do this to some of his generals in order to appease Antonescu, because the Romanian army is actually that important. But some of that, racial arrogance and that scapegoating down in the lower ranks, that kind of poisons the relationship for the rest of the war. Although the Romanians still, are more afraid of the Soviets than they are of even the Germans.
Okay, let's come on to your fifth and final myth now, Grant. And this kind of ties together everything we've been discussing up until this point. This is the idea that Romania couldn't wait to join the Allies when they did eventually switch allegiance in August 1944. What is the truth in that? Were they just waiting to switch sides?
Well, I think hopefully everything I've talked about so far is that no. I mean, Romania was not, dragged into this. And by 1940, it wasn't like they were waiting the entire time. And that's how it's often presented, that they really hadn't bought in to the German war aims, that they really were reluctant members of the Axis. And really, things could have gone differently. Antonescu, he was visiting the front, he was coming back to Bucharest, and then he was going to go to Transylvania, because the Soviets were breaking through in end of August of 1944. And so he was going to go create a national redoubt in southern Transylvania. And if the king, who had a small group of conspirators, hadn't acted, that might have happened. And you might have had the remnants of the Romanian army and German armies getting smashed, end up, kind of fighting along the Carpathian Mountains and holding the Soviets back, along that line. The Romanians might have kept fighting for the rest of the war. I think it's very possible. But instead, because the young king is able to get a few people in key areas, and I mean a few, he doesn't tell the army. The army does not know what's going on, because he doesn't trust most of the commanders, because they're too committed to the war. They're too loyal to the Germans. So, it's only a very few of the members of his royal house, like the officers assigned to his royal house staff, and a few key active duty officers who were in charge of the Capital Military Command, or the chief of staff, who's able to, of the Capital Military Command, who's able to convince his commander when the moment's right to shut down the city, so that after they arrest Antonescu, they can then kind of seal the city, make sure the Germans can't carry out a counter coup like they did with saving Mussolini in Italy. Instead, you're going to have Antonescu secured, and as everything falls apart on the front and the Germans are distracted, then the king can be able to kind of grab power and then use training units and reserve units to be able to halt any counter coup attempt by the Germans, and then declare that Romania has left the war. But it's very easy that it could have gone a different way. And I think that's really important to point out, that Romanians were still really, really, fearful of the Soviet Union, of this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism. I mean, they murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews, which they see as basically like controllers of the Soviets. They've participated in war crimes, in the Soviet Union. They don't want the Red Army on their land. And so it really takes this unique decision by the king to remove Romania, to open kind of the way to be able to take this different path, which then is turned into, kind of in the myth, like kind of this opportunistic of the entire country kind of just waiting to do this, which is not how it was.
Well, Grant, this has been fascinating. You have comprehensively busted those 5 myths for us. Thank you so much. Before you go, we always like to ask our guests to tell us one true fact that maybe not enough people know. What have you got for us?
And this is one I think even a lot of Romanians don't know it. Romania occupied a large swath of Ukraine and administered it. So there's parts of the occupied with the Germans, farther, and Crimea they occupied help occupy. But there's a part of Ukraine between the Dniester and the Bug rivers, this big swath, several million people live there, that they took over and administered almost as basically a colony, kind of an imperialistic project. It was used kind of initially as a dumping ground for Jews from Romania, from these reconquered territories from Bessarabia and Bukovina. They were what Jews hadn't been murdered were then deported to camps and ghettos. Local Jews that were then not killed in Odessa or other areas also were put in these camps and ghettos. At the same time, however, the Romanians want to appear to kind of as a civilizing force, and they invest some money in Odessa. They reopen the opera house. They give some money to like some of the local like elites, and there's kind of this attempt at a renaissance. Some of it's based off of plundering Jewish property, which is then sold in the black market, which then kind of creates this economic boom in the city. And the Romanians are, they don't have the same kind of viewpoint of the Germans of Slavs as Untermenschen and subhumans. So they actually aren't trying to starve the cities as the Germans did. So the conditions actually somewhat better in this area. So they also kind of resettle ethnic Romanians that they find in Crimea or the rest of Ukraine and try to bring them back to Romanianize this territory. And so it's a very interesting, kind of very forgotten aspect of the Axis occupation of the USSR. Usually there's just German occupied areas, but we have this part of Ukraine that was occupied by the Romanians. It's a useful and interesting kind of comparison to see what things are similar, what things are different, and can kind of compare and contrast, how different ideologies affected the locals differently.
It's a really interesting point to end on. Grant, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. The book is called Romania 1944, The Turning of Arms Against Nazi Germany. Grant Harward, thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today, but we will be back busting more historical myths very soon. And if there's anything you would like to see deconstructed, let us know in the comments below. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. That's it from us. Goodbye.